I'm Supak Keenitz, and I had the pleasure to be in front of Jim Bear Jacobs and our host, Chanda Smith-Baker, sharing their personal stories of racial discrimination and the work of helping to heal communities from historic trauma and racial discrimination happening today. Jim Bear believes when stories are passed down and told, then healing can take place. And of course, this is what's happening in this podcast. I feel it's important to share my experience when it happened to me, following the conversation and recording with Jim Bear and Chanda that happened several weeks back. On the day of recording, and as I'm listening to Jim Bear and Chanda discuss their stories, I begin to sob at length into the depths of my entire body. Little did I know the storytelling I was listening to was bringing up my own as an Asian American woman who identifies as LGBTQ. In the following days, I went into a frantic and restless mode, as if the energy from my body could not sit still, and I recognized how sick I became. I realized the start of my restlessness and frantic mode came from this conversation I was witness to with Jim Bear and Chanda. These stories are powerful. So I want to reiterate the work Chanda and Jim Bear is doing that is so proximate, so close to where the foundation of the disparity is coming from, and their understanding of pain, grievance, and hurt the community and themselves are facing. It has been a revelation to me and is making me go down a path of healing so I can have a voice like what I am doing now and be able to articulate my own behavior and actions that are caused by racial and gender discrimination and notice the injustice in our current systems. Not only do I admire Jim Bear and Chanda's work, but I admire them as a human and bringing their brilliance and compassion for the greater good. On behalf of the people who you have inspired, and on behalf of the Minneapolis Foundation, thank you to Jim Bear Jacobs and Chanda Smith-Baker.
So the first time that I remember meeting you, and by the way, you know my sister.
Who's that?
Shannon Smith-Jones.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
My only sibling, my baby sister. So yeah, you know her.
Yeah, she and I have done a couple of things throughout the years together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's a big fan of yours. But we met really through the Council of Churches philanthropy's role in hate when we bought Dr. Sekou in and we went to dinner. And I was really fascinated sort of with your grasp of history. I could have literally sat there at that dinner all night.
Yeah, well, especially with Sekou, man, the man just knows everything, you know.
and everything in every language.
Everyone, yeah.
How did that philanthropy's role in countering hate sort of come to be?
Yeah, so you know our CEO, Dr. Curtis DeYoung, and I say our CEO, that's at the Council of Churches here. That's a partnership with the Council of Churches and Imam, why is his name escaping?
Assad.
Yeah, Imam Assad. And that was really kind of a call to engage the philanthropic community and really hope to spark a conversation that kind of examined how philanthropy is carried out, and with the goal of eventually really getting creative in how philanthropic organizations, who they fund and what they fund. And when we're dealing with something like we call it encountering hate, that's not a tangible thing, right? That's not very easily measured. And so traditionally, things like philanthropic organizations like to fund things that are easily measured, where they can see a good kind of return on investment on that. And that gets difficult when you're dealing with these deep systemic problems And so we wanted to bring some of the philanthropic organizations together, really just sit them at a table, listen to some speakers, and just hear some story. And kind of the challenge of that being, how can we come together and creatively work towards solving this problem for the future? And so I believe the one where we brought in Dr. Sekou, I think that was our second annual.
The first one I didn't attend fully. We did sponsor both of them at the Minneapolis Foundation, but I do remember the first one, and the African-American woman from South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I was moved to tears and then like had to run to like another meeting, right? Like it just like brought out all of this stuff. And she had been impacted. I think she had a family member that was impacted by the Charleston shooting.
Yeah, the Charleston shooting. And then we also had, I can't remember if it was a rabbi or just...
there was a rabbi.
Yeah, from the Tree of Life shooting. Yeah.
Yeah. So you just touched on something that I think is interesting. And I guess two things that I thought. One is sort of the foresight of what's philanthropy's role in hate, why we were moving into a time, at least in my lifetime, where I haven't seen so much hate displayed.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's sort of this foresight, perhaps, on that aspect, or at least laying the foundation, and very interested in knowing whether or not you have seen philanthropy change how it's thinking about that work as a result of those convenings.
I think it would be, I have noticed philanthropy kind of changing strategy a little bit. I don't know if I would do a direct tie into our events. I think the call, sort of the generalized raising of consciousness, was certainly over the last 4 years, but even to a lesser extent, probably over the last decade, has warranted a change in strategy, a reexamination of strategy and looking forward. And also not just for philanthropy, but for any organization that wants to make change in the world, an examination of our own history and how we have helped perpetuate these systems in which hate gets embedded in. So philanthropy, when you talk about philanthropy, a lot of times you're talking about generational wealth, and that warrants a deep examination of how that generational wealth came to be, and really at whose cost. And so we're seeing that. I mean, certainly all good philanthropic organizations are adopting like DEI policies and statements and things like that. I mean, you would have a better insight into this, but as an outside observer, it seems like all of this is kind of happening in about the last 10 years. This examination of the internal institutional structures, and also projecting to the future how to help be about the solution. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that DEI efforts can both be good and harmful, right? I mean, there's definitely a collective pressure to do things, say things, make statements. There's pressure, right? So there's a performative aspect to it. But I have been seeing people that are organizing and examining both their history, their strategies, their processes, and getting in closer relationship with the work and the people whom they're working to impact. I definitely think that is true. And I think that it's public pressure. I think that there have been really painful moments like Floyd and like what happened at the Capitol on 1/6, and all of these things that I think are leading to us saying clearly we need to do more and we need to understand more. And I think that's right.
Yeah. it just seems like the atmosphere that surrounds us, whether it's political, institutional, when I was coming up in, through college and graduate studies, kind of what I was sort of acclimatized into was that we were probably in a post-racist society, but we were not in a post-racial society. We were in a society where the overt acts of racism were not necessarily an everyday occurrence, but that clearly there was still a racialized aspect of society. And I think now, with, particularly in the last 4 years, I don't even think I could confidently say we're in a post-racist society. It just, there's, and I say that not like it caught me off guard or anything. As an Indigenous man, I've had my fair share of those overt comments, but I think what did surprise me is the freedom that those entrenched racists felt to be very out and vocal with it. They felt a safety because, their ideologies were espoused from the top position of leadership. And
yeah.
Yeah.
For folks that are listening that maybe don't see the distinction between the two, could you provide the distinction between being sort of, how did you say, racist and racism?
What I was referring to is a post-racist society versus a post-racialized society. So, and I forget where I came across this information or who wrote about it. This is not my research or ideology or it's not my ideas, but the Jim Crow era would be a racist society, and then you shift into say, like, for example, someone with your name, Chanda, in the late 20th century, applying for employment positions, right? No one's going to come out and explicitly tell you you're not getting this job because you're Black, but that your name, that name, Chanda, on your job application is going to put you in a pile of less desirable candidates, right? So there's still that racialized aspect in society.
Sure. So I know Robin DiAngelo does talk a little bit about this, is that we have some in our minds, we have said, well, certainly I can't be part of racism because racism looks like a cross burning on the lawn, right? It looks like people yelling the N-word or yelling words at communities and being overt and obvious and dangerous towards a group of people. It certainly can't be the policies and the practices that I'm living under and supporting that would make me a racist or part of a racist system. And I think people do conflate those things, right? Being a racist and living and operating under a racist system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're seeing more recently with folks like Robin DiAngelo and Jim Wallace, Tim Wise, these researchers from the insider perspective of whiteness is we're really seeing a calling out of this construct of whiteness, right? That whiteness itself is a system that has been constructed, and as long as the system is constructed and it privileges whiteness, then there will always be a racialized aspect to the institutions and systems that are in place underneath that.
Yeah. The other thing that you mentioned when I said, there were kind of two ways that I was thinking about things. The other way was around this idea of making investments, philanthropy, making investments and things that can't be measured within 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And we did move really far as a sector into sort of impact reporting, ROI, return on investment, which has always been a really interesting thing of, me being from the neighborhood, like what is someone's ROI on me and my kids or whatever, right? Like, how do you really quantify? And the way that I moved through the world and seeing and working in community and understanding that a lot of times the best money spent is actually on people that really love and respect a community that wants to work within it, work for it, work on behalf of, and that show up in the unexpected times when the need is there, that could really guide a young person out of trouble or really be there for a family, that it doesn't sort of organize from 9 to 5 in some of the structures that we have created. And so it's those intangible things that I think are priceless, that are very hard to both articulate and measure. And so can you just talk about sort of the lack of investment, or your thoughts in terms of like sort of the reporting climate that we're in?
Yeah, it's, so most of my work for the last decade has been kind of invested in bringing forth to light the Indigenous story, particularly here in Minnesota. And so, just a little background. I started an organization back in 2011 called Healing Minnesota Stories. Our goal is just what I stated, to kind of illuminate Indigenous story and Indigenous history here in Minnesota, with the belief, and this is kind of an Indigenous worldview, that when our stories are passed on and told, then healing can take place, and particularly around historic trauma. And so when I started doing this, we created things like sacred sites tours, speakers bureaus, working on getting into pretty much every college and university, certainly in the Twin Cities, and most of the prominent and historic faith communities in the Twin Cities. And just to understand, before I took my job here at the Council of Churches 2.5 years ago, I spent the last 25 years of my life working in trades and, as a blue collar worker. So I had no idea about the philanthropic world, right? That's a whole nother world that I was unfamiliar with. But we would go, but I was connected to people who knew that world and they would encourage me and Healing Minnesota Stories to kind of apply for some small grants from the philanthropic world. And we tried a couple of times, and granted, this is just from my experience, but it was very difficult to get any kind of funding around things like telling stories to raise awareness, unless we were specifically seeking funding for a specific event where we could mark the number of people who would be in attendance. We could take a survey of all of this. But having said that, I've been doing these sacred sites tours, which is one of our main drivers at Healing Minnesota Stories. I've been doing them now since 2011, and every single year there's more and more interest. So there's a transformation, like there's impact within the community for this. And so we see that there's impact, there's interest generated. But more importantly, like me as a storyteller with that crowd, that group in front of me in some of these sacred sites telling that story, what I measure success in is not that, we're growing and we continue to have more people, but what I really thrive off of is when I'm telling the story and maybe someone has lived in the Twin Cities for 60, 70 years, and they've never heard the story of this particular place right beneath their feet. And I watch that moment of recognition, right? It's like a spark that that happens, but that's not measurable, right? And that's like how do you explain return on investment on things like sparks of consciousness?
Yeah, let me know, because I think that there are times, even with the podcast, right? There was a big discussion around, aren't we doing enough talking? Like, how do you measure the impact? For what purpose, right? And I'm like, there's talking and there's discovery, and then there's talking about the right things outside of maybe the way that you've understood it, that creates a little bit of discomfort or new awareness that I think is absolutely transformational. And I've gotten some wonderful feedback on, oh my God, that conversation had me think about this in a completely new way. I had no idea. And I think that is where the magic is.
Yeah, I was going to say, my experience early on in Healing Minnesota Stories is one experience, but I have been very encouraged with the philanthropic community. So I know you're aware at the council here, we have this program that we just acted and adopted at the close of 2020 around truth and reparations, and it's a brand new program, and from what we can tell, it's pretty cutting edge for a statewide ecumenical agency to say, okay, we really need to talk about the systematized racism within our own denominations, within our membership community. And we need to have very serious conversations, and we need to have action on reparations and what that looks like. And we have gotten a lot of positive feedback and investment from philanthropic communities for this program. And I think maybe it's twofold, right? The fact that it is pretty cutting edge and new, but also I think it's reflective of the internal work that philanthropic agencies have been doing to say, yeah, there is a way to, or there must be a way where we can help finance and create the way forward towards repair and healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I imagine part of the healing story work is really more centered in the truth, or is it also centered in the repair aspect of, or both?
You mean the work that I've been doing?
Yeah,
it's been more centered in the truth telling. It's getting those voices out there, right, and getting those stories out of the shadows, and so that's been where most of our work has been focused on. But not exclusively to that. We have had events where we will bring in Indigenous organizations that are doing the work of healing and repair, things like language and cultural reclamation projects, food sovereignty, land reclamation. We brought in some of these projects and had these moments where we'll tell our largely white audience, okay, this is the damage that was done in the founding of the history of Minnesota. This is how that impact lives today in Indigenous bodies in Minnesota. And this is how you can be about the work of repair. So get out your checkbook, clear your calendar for some volunteer hours. But this is, it's not a suggestion, right? Because we're dealing with faith communities, we can kind of lean on their own internal mandate of the gospel to be about the work of repair and say, this is what you are called by your sacred scriptures, by your doctrine to do. And this is what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. I know a little bit about the Sacred Sites Tour through the narrative of my sister who has been on one of the tours. I know Fort Snelling is one of those places, and I've recently come into my own awareness on some of the history at Fort Snelling. I don't know if I would steal the thunder or whatever the saying is if I asked you to share a little bit on that, but would you mind saying a little bit about maybe the history of one of the sites?
Yeah, so one of the sites we primarily focus on, as you mentioned, is Fort Snelling, and we don't actually visit the fort itself, mainly because it's such a big touristy spot up there. And if you grew up in Minnesota, you've been to Fort Snelling as a school age child. But we actually go down into the valley right below the fort, where the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River come together. And the Indigenous story that's held there in the Dakota language, that area is known as Bedote, which is where like the city of Mendota Heights gets its name, derives its name from. But that area there is so rich with story, not just from an Indigenous perspective and the trauma visited there, but also from the African American perspective. You have those two rivers that intersect, but there is a deep intersection of Black and Native story that intersect there. But the history that's held there is, for the Dakota people, it's the site of creation, right? So to use Judeo-Christian analogies, this is the Garden of Eden. It's the place of first creation. But also, following the war, the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, this was the site of a concentration camp where roughly 1,700 Dakota elders, women, and children were imprisoned, kept in a stockade fence there in that valley for the winter of 1862 to 1863. And, it's a site of deep historic trauma. The conditions were so bad there that about 3 to 4 people were dying every single day, 3 to 4 Dakota people. So in that period of about 5 months, they lost about 300 people. And from there, they were ultimately exiled out of the state of Minnesota. So in the spring of 63, they were loaded onto cattle barges at the river there, and they were sent down the river to St. Louis, where they caught the Missouri River and went up the Missouri and were kind of offloaded into this prisoner of war camp in the middle of South Dakota. And the conditions were so bad that winter, not only did they lose 300 people during that winter, but they lost an additional 300 after they were exiled from disease and trauma that were faced while they were there. And what's interesting is, I talk about the intersection of Black narrative and Native narrative right there. That same spring, as the Dakota people are being exiled on cattle barges down the river, the very first raft, because it wasn't really a barge, but the very first raft was coming up the river that had 75 newly emancipated slaves that were, and they must have, Chanda, they must have crossed each other, because the nearest I can get in the research I've done is it was not a matter of months. It was a matter of weeks, if not days, from the one barge, the barges taking the Dakota people out, to this first wave of the first 75 people, emancipated slaves coming up into Minnesota, And beyond that, right, Fort Snelling has a history of slavery being enforced at Fort Snelling. The famous Dred and Harriet Scott case, that was all precipitated around Fort Snelling. And, it wasn't widespread slavery being utilized here in Minnesota. But because Minnesota was not yet a state and the fort itself was federal land, then you had these Southern officers who would be stationed at the fort, and they were given an amount of money to basically to pay for their servants. Well, if they're slave owners, then you don't have to pay for your servants. That's just extra money in your pocket. So yeah, the United States military incentivized the use of slavery even in free northern territories. back then?
I have so much in my head about this story, and most of it feels very, very personal. So first, I was thinking that I have a couple of stories. One, my mom tells me when I was on a playground, and there was a little white girl that was playing, and her mother, and the little girl came up and called me the N-word, and she said I just looked like was so offended, and I came to her and just like stood in front of her. And my mom used to say to me, like, I didn't even know you knew what it was. I don't even know if you knew the word, but you knew that it wasn't right. And you just came and looked at me like I've just been assaulted in some way. And my mom trying to navigate my 3-year-old self around that, right? Like no memory whatsoever. The next time I remember being called an N-word was actually in the bathroom at Fort Snelling.
Wow.
I went in there and this older white woman said, I don't use bathrooms with N-words.
What age would you have been there?
I would have been in my 20s.
Wow.
And I was in a training there. I don't even remember anything else about that experience, but I remember going in the bathroom and I was washing my hands or something like that. But I remember not saying anything. Right? Like I remember looking at her, and if I did say anything, Jim Barry was like, what did you just say? Because I couldn't believe that she said it. And I remember just going and not being able to be in the rest of my day, like being excited about being whatever I was invited to, but sitting in that for the rest of the day, like I can't believe I just encountered that, and actually spent time thinking, what other word could she have said? Maybe I misheard her.
Oh, so you were trying to rationalize the offense out of, right? Okay. Isn't that funny how we do that, right? Sometimes, because I do that too, right? When someone will just say something overtly racist, and I don't know. I don't know if it's just me, but it sounds like it was you in this instance. You're trying to give the benefit of the doubt to white people. And
she deserved no benefit of the doubt.
No.
I mean, it was so clear, and it stuck with me, and it bothered me for so long, and it comes up every now and then because it was just so, she was just so sweet, just a sweet little old white lady, just like, I don't use bathrooms with you, and I'm just like, wow. Another quick story and then I'll tell you the other sort of thing I was thinking about was my kids were going to Harvest Prep, and this is one of my favorite stories to tell, but there's a lot in this, and they were learning about civil rights and Jim Crow, and we went to the restroom. They need to use the restroom, and we were at Target out in one of the outer suburbs, and my son comes. I go in the bathroom, you guys. I'll be right out here. And they came running out, and they're like, it's for whites only. And I'm like, what? And they're like, it's a white only bathroom. There's no people, there's no Black people in there. And so they were learning about Jim Crow, and they're young. They're like first grade, third grade. They weren't able to separate in their mind what was from what is. Okay. And so they're like, I don't belong in there. Like, I'm in danger. And they come flying out. And I'm just like, what is happening? Like, what are you talking about? No, you were completely safe going in there. And I guess it's when you talk about trauma that lives in the body, or telling of history in these episodic ways that don't provide the right context. Right? Like the way that it could manifest itself in very harmful ways. And at the time, I mean, I tell it now kind of like, I can't believe that happened because it was a little bit funny, but it wasn't really funny. And I really did have to manage my sons around that.
Wow. Yeah. It's funny how sometimes, the mundane things, sort of the everyday, shows us where the trauma resides, right? And I mean, this was not so mundane, but a few years ago, I was doing one of these tours, and we were at Pedote. We were below the fort, and at the time, my partner that I did the tours with was a gentleman named Bob, who's a Dakota man, 60, 67 years old, and just a very dear friend of mine. And we did these tours together, and we're down there. We got a group of 30 some people. I believe they were all graduate students at the U of M in like the Department of Public Health or something. Anyway, we're doing the tour, and I'm telling the story of like the trauma that's held in the land, and we hear this shout from on top of the bluff, which is where the fort is situated. We hear this shout. I didn't really pay attention to it because it was off in the distance, but then we heard it. I heard it coming closer and closer, and you know, I'm the storyteller at this point in the tour, and I'm kind of focusing on my story, trying not to get distracted. And as I'm right in like the deepest part of the trauma of the story, the U.S. Marine Corps starts jogging, marching, literally 20 feet from us on this bike path, going up, and it was probably 300 of them, and they were just running drills, right? It's part of their training and that, but they run up, and it was, and I should say it looked to be like an ROTC program or something, because a lot of them were young kids, but so there's probably like 300 students or young kids, and probably 30, adults, Marines in their battle fatigues, and they're all like, even the kids are carrying. I'm assuming they're not real like M16s, but they got their field pack and that. And like I had to stop. I had to stop telling the story, and everyone in the group, I could just feel this collective tension rising as we're talking about trauma visited on Indigenous people by the United States military. And now the US military is showing their force in this space, like this space where Indigenous people died. Indigenous people were buried in the ground there. And you all think it's appropriate for you to run your like, this is a memorial, like there's signage, there's a structure indicating that this is a memorial, and you think it's okay to run your military drills here. And I actually called the Marines afterwards, about 2 weeks later, gave myself some time to cool, called them about 2 weeks later. And what struck me was I ended up talking with the sergeant who was running those drills that day. And what struck me is he knew what this space was for Indigenous people, but he was so utterly amazed that any Indigenous person would take offense at the running of these drills. And I was just, I couldn't believe it, like just that audacity, because it's not even ignorance at that moment, right? It's not even ignorance. It's just, I don't even know what you would call that. It's just this sheer audacity.
Can we just talk about that for a second? Because there are moments like the psychological safety, right? Like you were, you're talking about trauma, and then you are intentional about reaching out to just talk about what that traumatic experience was like, and sort of the sanctity of life and history and the memorial and just respect, and just trying to provide perspective to be further traumatized by response. And I watched this cycle that happens a lot where we're trying to break through, or people are trying to break through, where we need to have breakthroughs in terms of our understanding of history and how we honor each other in our histories. And that is dangerous work, right? It's emotionally dangerous, psychologically dangerous. And I don't think that people broadly understand those risks that are being taken every day in small and big ways?
Yeah, I would say one caveat to which I would say that generally white people are not aware of that. I think Black people, I think Indigenous people, I think other people of color are aware, are mostly aware of that cost, right? But it's, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It's funny how it shows up. So my wife is a very wonderful white woman, right? And and as I said, I've been doing this work for 10 years, a little more than 10 years. And I remember one day I was home, but I had to leave because I had an event I had to go speak at, right? And so I was getting ready to go, saying goodbye to my wife, give her a kiss and all that. And she was like, she was mocking being upset, right? She's saying, "Oh, I'll stay here with the kids and you go off and have your fun." She wasn't really that upset, but she was just making fun of that situation, right? And I was so surprised at my response because I didn't have any animosity towards her, and I didn't feel attacked or anything, right? But I just, like, my response was, "Do you understand that I'm about to go and talk about racism and historic trauma for the next 3 hours? And this is personal to me. Like, there's nothing about this that is fun. I don't enjoy that I have to do this." And it's interesting because, like, my wife just kind of went like, "Whoa!" Like she knows that, right? She sees me when I come home, and I'm just drained and exhausted, and I don't want to talk to anyone, right? She knows that it takes a toll. And granted, my response to her was disproportionate to the little joke she made, but I was more surprised at my own response because I know that she's aware, like she's conscious of all of these things. But I think it was just one of those moments where, like, your body reminds you there is a cost to this, right? Your consciousness reminds you that there is a cost to this, and it is like I mean, I know you experience it too. You might be presenting at an event or talking to certain people or a group, and you just come away and you're like, you feel a trauma response in your body. And
yes,
yeah.
And I know I brought my kids in, and you brought your family in, and here we are, adults that have experienced a lot, and still find ourselves reacting and being triggered. And thankfully, most of us know how to navigate the triggering in our employment environments, right? And other environments that we're in, and that there's a level of resolve on who we are and what maybe our purpose and our roles are. But I do think about our young people that are also holding trauma in their bodies and responding, and the responses are not healing. They're not aware of the trauma that our young people are experiencing.
Yeah. So my oldest daughter is 14 years old, and when she was in the fourth grade, one of the projects that they had to do in school was just kind of a basic research Native American culture, and do a little presentation, right? And so naturally, me being her dad, I'm like, okay, we're gonna knock this one out of the park, right? So we brought in family artifacts and, just like put together a killer presentation. And her teacher afterwards called my wife and said that my daughter's presentation was so good, and without even knowing it, it actually it taught on all of the benchmarks criteria that is required for that lesson. And so the teacher said, I would like her to do this not just for our class, but all the fourth grade. And then so she came back and did it for the other classes in fourth grade. And then she did it the next year. She moved on to fifth grade, but came back to the fourth grade, did it. And on the third year, she was invited back, and this is something she always looked forward to, the third day, or the third year when she came back, to do the presentation. I was excited for her because she was excited about it. And when I got home that day, I went to her and I just wanted to do a check-in, say, hey, how'd your presentation go? How you feel it went? And her face was just down and she was upset. And I said, well, what happened? Like, you really like doing this? And she didn't want to talk about it. And finally, I let her have some time and then came back to it later in the evening. And I said, so tell me what happened today. And she just kind of started crying. And she said, the kids asked me why we were so mean and scalped people all the time. And I was like, as a father, I'm like, okay, we're going to do some educating here, do that. But I'm like, I can't protect her from this. Everything about me wants to protect her and shield her from this. And so we had a very frank conversation about, if this is something you want to do, you want to be a spokesperson, you want to be, like your dad, you want to do this. Unfortunately, this is some of the ignorance you're going to face, and it hurts. And to the people who are asking those questions, they're trying to be funny, they're trying to be cute, and maybe they don't know. Right here I go again, right? Giving the benefit of the doubt. But these are kids.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's just so many stories that we can tell, right? And I think about, even a time, and so the other story that I was thinking about when you were telling before Snelling is like the African-American folks coming here and the Native folks going to South Dakota. And I have Lakota lineage in my family. And I'm I'm thinking as you're saying it, that's how my people met. Like, I don't know my history well enough to know. So I have to fill in holes and imagine what it's like, because it's so difficult to trace. And it's always was a very sad thing for my mom to not really kind of have sort of an understanding of her complete background and history and lineage. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's two things. One is the things that happen in schools where they're go back and trace your genealogy and tell us when your grandparents or great grandparents arrived in this country. And then my kids, and I'm trying to get their assignment done. And these teachers are creating trauma in my house, because don't they know how African-American people arrived in this country? Don't you know, there's slave books that have birth dates on it with no names. It's very difficult to trace. And I'm trying to manage so they get a good grade on an assignment that I think is abusive, and, trying to navigate this space. So now fast forward, I'm an adult. I'm at a board meeting somewhere, and we start out and the people go around and they said, well, we want to just open up the meeting. We want everyone to talk about their history, their family history, and tell us a story about your arrival to this country. And by the way, they decided to burn sage as a thing, right? So they're burning sage and they're talking about these practices. And I don't think they should be doing that either. But they did that. And I start crying. And I think it was all this stress. And I'm listening to all these stories. And by the eighth one, it's me. And I cannot stop crying. And I'm just what is happening to me right now? I'm not a crier. I'm literally in a board meeting, just and I'm I pass. I just freaking pass. And I'm going back to my hotel and I'm done with this whole thing. I'm done with the damn day. That's where I'm at. And I'm what? And it's just, we're in a moment where a lot of this stuff is bubbling up in our communities. I think the understanding, the misunderstanding, the doubling down on who we are, what we're trying to protect is a very real thing. And it feels very threatening in a number of ways. And here we are in a city where we're getting ready to go into the Floyd trial. And I'm thinking about all the bubbling up and all of the things that could be said and misunderstood, and thinking about what is my role in my house, in my community, in my job, to think through whatever leadership I have available. How do I contribute to healing and repair during a time that clearly needs it. Have you been thinking at all about this season that we're living in?
Oh, yeah. The very fact that I know that the trial starts on March 8th, right? I have never in my life consciously known when any trial starts, ever, right? And the fact that, like, I don't even have to have it written down. I just know March 8th, that's when the trial starts. And, I've been thinking, so there's, I do a lot of work and am connected with a number of community organizers. And sort of the feeling that I'm feeling from kind of a collective group of community organizers in that is we need to plan to be ahead of this for damage mitigation, trauma mitigation. And so I just got out of a meeting yesterday with a friend of mine, a Black woman pastor, and she's inviting me in to be part of this planning for, I don't even know what to call it, not really a memorial, but just like an event, maybe a vigil would be a way to put it, to run the whole day at George Floyd Square on the first day of the trial, and it just feels like I don't know, it just feels like it's coming, right? You can see the waves building offshore, and it's coming. You don't know how bad it's going to be. You don't know what the damage is going to do, but you know that something is going to happen. And so, we're just trying to be part of a work that says, I don't even know if you could call it healing at this point, right? It's too early in the game to call it healing. At this point, it's like we're just trying to minimize damage. We're just trying to minimize hurt. And
What's sad to me is when you talk to folks and you're like, what do you expect? It's like, I don't expect anything. I don't expect justice.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a community that believes in the system, and there's communities that don't believe justice will ever happen. And those are the realities. And I think the work of like trying to close that.
Yeah. And I think those that believe in the system are the ones who have benefited from the system historically, right? I haven't talked to one Black person that has any confidence that Chauvin will be found guilty, right?
Or he'll be found guilty in the way that Breonna Taylor's.
Yeah.
Right, like for the bullet going through the ceilings.
Yeah, you're guilty for shooting a wall, but not a person, right? And I think we even talked about this when we sat down together with Dr. Glad. This idea, the line we get fed all the time, to trust the system, to trust the process. Like, there has never been a system or a process created or imagined in which we can inherently trust. They are not, and so this appeal to trust the legal system, there has never been anything demonstrated that says that we can.
Do you think that the system can be reformed?
I used to.
Mm.
I used to be much more optimistic about it. I don't know. This is just me being honest. I fluctuate back and forth between there is possibility of some hardcore reform from that perspective, and to just tear it down and start something new, create something new.
I have been in the create something new, and then I'm like, and then where would they hire the people?
Yeah.
would show up, but the same people that either have the interest and who are the pool. And I think it's just a really complicated time. I don't know. I know one of the other things that we touched on and something else that's, we were talking about sacred sites. I think we talked about land acknowledgements.
Mm-hmm.
And there's sometimes that I think it is presented in a way that really allows me to hear the words and understand the purpose of that acknowledgement. And then there's times that it feels like it's an agenda item. And I really wrestle, right? And if I'm being 100% honest, I would say yes. And then, there's the land acknowledgement and then acknowledgement of the free labor that built the stuff that was on it, right? All of this stuff, right, that I'm going through in my African-American body, my Black body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you, do you think that land acknowledgement is a sign of progress and hope?
So I have consulted on a number of land acknowledgements, and I will only consult with organizations that I trust are actually using this not as a culmination of their racial consciousness work, but as a starting point, right? Because, a land acknowledgement is the very minimum that you can do, right? It's one step up from doing nothing. So when I consult on land acknowledgements, I say a responsible land acknowledgement needs to include three things. It needs to be specific. So in other words, it's not enough to say we recognize that this was Indian land. You have to specifically name the tribes. And if you can do the research, name the villages of the people. Be specific in naming treaties that were violated that allowed you to be in possession of the land. So it needs to be specific. Number two, it needs to be contemporary. You can't speak of Native people in past terms, right? You have to bring them into the 21st century. Bring them into the 21st century. Where are those people now? What are the conditions which cause them to not be here now, to be displaced and dislocated? Or if they're not, if they're no longer exist, name that genocidal practice, name that, mourn that. And then number three, and I think this is most important, it needs to recognize your institution's complicity in the building of this structure, and it needs a commitment to undoing the harms. And I say if it doesn't have those three things, then it's not it's not something that I would put my stamp of approval on. You have to name a commitment to being about the work of repair.
So we have that. And then I've been engaged in a conversation about the use of BIPOC.
Okay. Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about that too. I was in the most hilarious conversation the other day where this older woman that I know and just love dearly, and she's like, I really thought it was about bisexual people of color. I didn't really know I was a BIPOC. And I'm just like, what are we talking about right now? But I'm like, these new terms keep coming up. And I think we talked about that too, because I react in a not positive way when I hear that language. Mm-hmm. But I'm also sensitive that when you say people of color, it doesn't acknowledge the Indigenous communities. And so I'm really kind of exploring. I have my own sort of biological reaction when I hear it. And it doesn't my body does not like the language. But how do you respond to that?
I've come to accept it as just a shorthand. But I always say, and this kind of comes up to the age-old question, which I know is has been the same for African American communities as well. But the question, is, well, what do we call you, right? Is Black appropriate? Negroes out of fashion now. African American. ADOS is now coming into fashion, and we in the Native community have face that as well. American Indian, Indigenous peoples, Native American. And so I don't have a shorthand answer for the Black community, but for the Indigenous community, I say be as specific as you can. So if you don't know if you should call me a Native American or American Indian, my tribe is the Mohican Nation. I'm Mohican. You're not going to get in any trouble if you say, hey, I was talking to Jim Bear Jacobs the other day, who's a Mohican. Like that's my identity. And I think in that, and so like when people ask, I get asked, for people are writing, term papers and stuff for college, and they're like, how do I reference you? And I say, you write out my name, then you put parentheses, Mohican Nation, and that's all you have to do. And then you don't have to mess with the weird political terminology, because it does get, it gets messy. John Trudell, who was a Lakota poet and activist, he said, you all have difficulty with like American Indian and Native American and all of these because we are older than the institution of America itself. We don't fit into your political definitions because we're older than politics. And so, yeah, I mean, BIPOC, I don't know. I remember when I first started seeing it, and I was like, oh, what is this? And now it's just kind of become a shorthand. I don't have a strong reaction, but I know that some people do. And now with the term, the ADOS term, American Descendants of Slavery. And then I even recently came across the ADOX, which is American Descendants of Chattel Slavery, which I don't really know why the distinction is necessary. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a strong reaction. I'm curious though, like you said, you have a reaction. What do you think where that's from?
I really honestly don't know. I think it's that maybe it's the politicized way. I think that it's grouping everyone together.
Yeah.
Right. And that there's no way that you like the strategies to support communities are not the same. The histories are not the same. And I think that there's something around that I'm reacting to. I think, sort of combating anti-Blackness, I think that there's other ways for people to be explicit. It's starting to feel, again, to me, just sort of a shorthanded way for people to feel like they are aware, woke, on top of it, like, paying attention to things. And so you can go into a meeting and you can do your pronouns, your land acknowledgement, and work with BIPOCs and then just be on the journey. And I just, I guess if I see the work underneath it, because I understand, I don't know if I understand or if I'm excusing the shorthanded nature of it. And maybe it's, I honestly had the same reaction as a Northsider when people started saying, are you from Nomi? And I'm like, what the hell is Nomi? Right? Like, who did this? Like, my family's been here for 5 generations. I don't even know what the hell a Nomi is. And here we are marketing a community that has history. What are we doing here? Like, where do we preserve history, and why do we get a new name every 5 years or whatever?
Yeah.
So I don't know what it is. And I think I have to unpack it myself, but there's just a lot of reaction. I prefer that if we're writing it, we use it and we're part of an ecosystem and we move when it moves. But I'm like, for folks around me, if you're going to use it, just spell it out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And don't use BIPOC as an acronym, but spell out, like, give at least the acknowledgement of writing it out.
Yeah. No, I can definitely see that. And it's funny you bring up Nomi. I remember when I first started encountering that, I'm like, oh, now that Northside's becoming gentrified, we got to come up with a fancy, marketable name for it. Yeah, I will say this. Now that I think about it, I mean, I don't have a strong reaction to BIPOC, but it does. I'm more comfortable when actual people from the Black, Indigenous, or people of color community use it as a shorthand than if I'm sitting, with a bunch of white people and they're like, "Oh, we want a speaker from the BIPOC community." I'm like, well, you don't even know who that is.
And then I do respond though when people are like, as a POC, and I'm like, as a POC, like I'm gonna be like, as a Black woman, like when did we start, like as a person of color? And I mean, I guess I have used that, and then I check myself, but I'm just like, we're getting wrapped up in stuff, and I just hope that we're doing the work underneath it, which really matters. And the language, language is always important to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. There's just, I don't even know where to go with that one. But I guess I have to wrap. I could literally talk all day, but there's so much heaviness. And one of our values at the Minneapolis Foundation is that hope is essential. And I'm curious on what you're feeling most hopeful about right now.
What I am feeling most hopeful about is, so one of probably the central issue for Indigenous people in Minnesota right now, I should say one of the most immediate issues, is trying to stop Enbridge Line 3 pipeline up in northern Minnesota. What I am most hopeful about is the level of strong Indigenous women leadership in this. I'm more hopeful about that than I am actually in stopping the pipeline, right? I hope the pipeline is stopped. I hope that we don't have to fight these fights again in the violation of Indigenous sovereignty. But I feel that some of the greatest leadership on this issue is Indigenous women. Winona LaDuke, Tara Hauska, and a whole host of others. And there is a certain swell of hope and pride, whether I'm on social media or watching news coverage, seeing Winona or Tara or others with the bullhorn, standing on the front lines. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about that. And also what I'm hopeful about, was giving me hope, is the number of white people that are stepping up to this fight and saying, okay, we know that people are getting arrested, and it should be white people that are putting their bodies in jeopardy and getting arrested before it's Native people. And so the willingness for white people to step up to this and pay the price. And I hope that is a continuing trend that spreads through communities, through Black community. We saw it some in the wake of George Floyd, white allies actually doing more than just talking. And I hope as we move into the trial period that continues.
Yeah, I think it will. And I mean, white allyship has always been the case. There's been a lot of other things, but I think about the civil rights movement and the white allies that were very instrumental during that time. And I think that when you think about allyship, sometimes we also simplify that. And the allies that step into the danger zone with us, I think, is what we're talking about, right? To really put some things at risk.
Yeah,
is what we're talking about.
Yeah, I forget who said it, but I remember someone saying, I don't need white allies, I need white accomplices that are going to come in and disturb things with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate your work. I know that we'll be working together on the truth and reparations work. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm glad you guys are stepping into that leadership. It's such an important time for that. The Minneapolis Foundation is doing our best, right, to look at our history, our approach, where we can be smarter and more proximate, where we can be in partnership and try to better recognize our power and privilege and use that in a way that promotes and amplifies the voices of community and their work. And I'm really proud to be in this moment of transformation and leading that at the foundation. So, more to come. I'll be thinking of you during the trial, and hopefully you're thinking of me. And if there's anything that we can do, either personally or organizationally, please let me know.
Oh, absolutely. Appreciate this. Thank you.
That's Jim Bear Jacobs and our host, Chanda Smith-Baker. If you like what you hear, please follow us on wherever you listen to your podcast. I'm Sue Pot-Kienitz from the Minneapolis Foundation. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Chanda.